The United States Navy accused a dead 24-year-old sailor of mass murder, and they spent 2 years defending that accusation before independent science proved them wrong. On April 19, 1989, the USS Iowa, a floating monument to American naval power since World War II, was running a training exercise in the Caribbean Sea, off the coast of Puerto Rico. Turret 2 was given the order to fire. Exactly 81 seconds later, the turret's center gun suffered a catastrophic malfunction. The resulting blast tore back into the ship, erupting into a 2,500-degree fireball. Because the turret was enclosed by thick steel armor designed to repel enemy fire, the explosion had nowhere to go. It was trapped, contained, and it consumed everyone inside. 47 sailors working within those sealed walls were killed instantly. In the minutes after the blast, survivors from adjoining compartments fought their way toward turret 2 through smoke and jammed hatches, uncertain whether a second explosion was coming. Damage control teams flooded the powder magazines below the turret as a precaution, a decision that likely prevented an even larger catastrophe, but one that also destroyed physical evidence investigators would later need. By the time Rear Admiral Milligan's team boarded the ship the next morning, cleanup crews were already at work, and critical forensic material from inside the turret had been disturbed, contaminated, or was simply gone. Military accidents happen. Usually they end in safety overhauls, in institutional reflection, in change. The aftermath of the Iowa explosion took a different path entirely. It became one of the most egregious institutional cover-ups in modern American military history. Iowa was not just any ship. Commissioned in 1943, she had once carried President Franklin Roosevelt and the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff across the Atlantic to the Tehran Conference. She was the lead ship of the most advanced class of battleships the United States ever built, a genuine piece of naval history, still carrying live ammunition and a full crew in 1989, more than 4 decades after she was launched. Her signature weapon was the 16-inch gun, capable of hurling a 2,700-pound shell over 20 miles. Firing one of those guns was not a single action. It was a precise, 4-story-deep mechanical ballet, requiring dozens of sailors working in cramped, sweltering compartments to hoist powder bags from the magazine below, seat, a projectile in the breech, and ram silk powder bags home in careful, timed sequence. One mistake anywhere in that sequence, a bag rammed too fast, a chamber sealed too early, a crew member out of position, and the entire process could turn lethal in a fraction of a second. The sudden loss of 47 American sailors demanded an answer, and fast. Congress wanted one. The press wanted one. 47 grieving families wanted one most of all. The Navy launched an official investigation, led by Rear Admiral Richard Milligan. For the first 3 weeks, the investigation followed the evidence toward mechanical failure, toward the ship itself. Then, on May 8, 1989, that changed. Milligan brought in the Naval Investigative Service, and the entire direction of the inquiry shifted. During those early interviews, a sailor named Dale Meyer told investigators about an unauthorized gunnery experiment, one that senior officers aboard Iowa had personally allowed to proceed. According to Meyer, the officer running that interview stopped the stenographer mid-sentence, pulled him into the passageway, and told him bluntly to stop talking about the experiments. From that moment forward, the investigation's focus shifted away from the ship's leadership and maintenance failures, and on to one man, gunner's mate Clayton Hartwig. When Milligan's findings were finally released months later, they bypassed mechanical failure entirely. The Navy's official conclusion, deliberate sabotage, most likely carried out using a chemical or electronic detonator. And they had their suspect already picked out, Hartwig, a sailor who had died in the very blast the Navy now claimed he had intentionally caused. Blaming a mechanical catastrophe on a dead man, who could no longer speak for himself, should have raised alarms immediately. To understand why the Navy reached for that explanation instead of looking at its own ship, you have to look at what was actually happening below deck in the years leading up to that morning. Throughout the 1980s, the Reagan administration pushed hard to build a 600-ship Navy. To hit that number on a limited budget, the Navy dragged aging mid-century battleships out of mothballs and rushed them back into active service. Iowa was one of them, a World War II hull carrying Cold War responsibilities she was never fully modernized to handle. Her turrets were falling apart. Inspections had logged more than 75 known mechanical faults across the ship. All three main gun turrets had severe, long-ignored hydraulic leaks. $1 million repair jobs had been approved, and then abruptly cancelled by the ship's own command. The ammunition was just as compromised. Iowa was firing D8 for 6 gunpowder, propellant dating back to World War II. Navy regulations required that powder be stored cool to remain chemically stable. Months before the explosion, these specific powder bags had instead been left baking on aluminum storage barges, in temperatures reaching 125 degrees. And on the morning of the disaster, an inexperienced gun crew was running an unauthorized experiment, combining this aging, heat-stressed powder with maximum-weight 2,700-pound shells, in an unapproved attempt to extend the gun's firing range. The ship's commanding officer, Captain Fred Mussoli, had been misled into believing this experiment was authorized from higher up the chain. It was not. A single civilian safety office employee, with no authority to approve anything of the kind, had simply told the crew to proceed. Follow the chain of command, and the chain of blame runs in one direction. An accident under these conditions doesn't stop at the gun crew. It runs straight up through the ship's commanding officers, to the fleet admirals, who signed off on deploying a battleship that had already failed its own inspections. Admitting that meant admitting systemic negligence, and systemic negligence threatens careers, budgets, and an entire battleship reactivation program that senior officers had personally staked their reputations on. For the Navy's hierarchy to survive this, the disaster could not be a systems failure. It had to be one man. To build the case against Clayton Hartwig, investigators seized on a detail that seemed damning at first glance. Hartwig had taken out a $50,000 life insurance policy, naming a fellow sailor, Kendall Trout, as the beneficiary. What the Navy's own report conveniently left out was that Hartwig had taken out that policy more than 2 years before the explosion, a routine decision, not a suspicious one. When the families later filed lawsuits seeking accountability for the deaths and for the smear campaign that followed, the cases were dismissed. The federal government was shielded by sovereign immunity, and a magistrate judge ultimately ruled that pure defamation claims could not proceed against the United States under existing law. No one, not an admiral, not an investigator, not the Navy itself, was ever held personally accountable for what happened to Clayton Hartwig's name. The USS Iowa herself never fired her 16-inch guns in anger again after that morning. Within a few years, all 4 Iowa-class battleships were decommissioned for the final time, closing out the era of the American battleship entirely. But the ship itself was never really the point. The point is, what happens when an institution investigates itself? The USS Iowa tragedy exposes a dark and repeatable pattern in institutional self-preservation. When a powerful organization's survival is threatened by its own negligence, it will use every tool at its disposal to rewrite the truth, even if that means destroying the reputation of a man who can no longer defend himself. In the end, it wasn't the Navy's internal review, its public relations office, or its own admirals who cleared Clayton Hartwig's name. It was independent, outside scientific scrutiny, physics that refused to lie, even when the institution investigating itself was willing to. Every branch of the military, and every large organization with something to protect, has faced the same temptation the Navy faced in the summer of 1989: control the narrative before someone else controls it for you. Sandia National Laboratories had no career on the line, no admiral billets to protect, and no institutional reputation riding on the outcome. That's precisely why its conclusions held up.